Hey there, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad you could make it. Now, the other night I read a few Bigfoot encounters out of a book titled The Big Book of Bigfoot by Brad Grogan, and he's given me the green light to read a lot more from his book. And as promised, I'm going to do the great big encounter called the Bostwick Massacre. Now, I'm going to read the preamble, I guess you could call it that, from the author, explaining how he came to this. And then I'm going to read you the Bostwick Massacre. Now, be warned, there's a little bit of a setup with this story. It doesn't get right to the Bigfoot. So grab your snackage, saddle up, and let's get down to business and head on into Sasquatch Valley. The word from the author. The Bostwick Massacre, Alaska, 1970s. This is the most interesting and crazy Bigfoot story I've ever heard. It seriously could be a Hollywood movie, which, to be honest, the industry desperately could use. There are not that many good Bigfoot-related movies. The person sharing the story is the guy who actually experienced the Bigfoot encounter. He is getting older and wanted an accurate account of what happened to be documented, even if it is just in a random Bigfoot book. He doesn't want any fame. He isn't interested in making money off his tale. Initially, I planned to write a full-length book about the encounter, but the man would only share his details of the story if I promised to not interview a bunch of people from his hometown. I agreed to the stipulation. With that said, this is the story that he shared with me. I've edited it to fix some grammar and structural mistakes and to try and keep the story flowing and easy to read, but I tried to leave it in his voice as much as possible. This is one y'all will have to decide if you believe it or not. I want to believe it's true, but either way, it's a heck of a story. Names, dates, and locations have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved. This event happened prior to 1970. Chapter 1. I won't bore you with too much color and filler. You are obviously reading this story for a reason, which isn't for tons of background information and history of my hometown or my personal life. My backstory isn't that relevant or interesting, to be honest. I'm going to just jump headfirst into the reason you are reading this, an incredible Sasquatch encounter. I was a freshman at the University of Alaska Anchorage studying journalism in the hopes of someday becoming a famous writer. After a pretty easy first semester, I traveled back home for winter vacation. I'd brought my college girlfriend with me, a 20-year-old beauty from Seattle whose lifetime dream was to experience the real Alaska. She wasn't that impressed with the 10-degree below zero Anchorage weather, but Katrina was super excited to experience the 15 feet of snow that had already fallen in southeast Alaska. The journey from Anchorage to my hometown is a crazy one that most members of the lower 48 would have a hard time comprehending. You can't take a direct flight, and you can't make the entire trip in a day. One day of flying on a jet and making multiple stops, an overnight stay at a hotel, then a ride on a float plane or a long trip on a small ferry. Sometimes you even have to leave Alaska and go through Canada just to make it back to Alaska. After all that, you finally arrive in my hometown, which has a total population of 75 people. Yes, you read that right. Population 75. A fun little town, known for its large grizzly bear population and massive yearly snowfall. And also has a really cool glacier that you can walk on. And depending on how brave or dumb you are, you can walk into openings and tunnels inside of it. But yeah, 75 people. A place most residents chose to live because they didn't want to be part of a big city or to have government regulations dictate everything they did. Despite its rough reputation, the people were generally friendly and everybody looked after everyone else. It was one big, huge, dysfunctional family. The government and police weren't needed or wanted. And did I mention that in some winters we would get 30 feet of snow? Yeah, that's not a misprint or hyperbole. Look it up. There were a few winters where the snowpack was as high as your roof. You shoveled out your front door and a few windows, then waited for the rest to melt. Chapter 2. After the grueling 2-day trip from Anchorage, Katrina and I finally arrived in Hyder. Day 1 was great. My parents loved her. LOL, that's not always a guaranteed outcome. They fed us a big feast of shrimp and Dungeness crab for dinner, and we settled in for the night. Day 2 was spent exploring the area and showing Katrina all the cool sights and places. We walked on the glacier. Katrina said it was one of the coolest things she had ever experienced. We visited a few of my old friends, and I had Katrina meet some of the people I grew up with. Remember, we had less than 75 people in town, so a friends and family reunion and town tour didn't take very long. We had a very small one-room store that was our combined grocery, pharmacy, and hardware store. All prices were double or triple what you'd find anywhere else in the world. After visiting a few old friends, I finally ran into one of my best high school buddies, a solid dude named Rich Love, and he gave me news that would change all of our lives forever. But I don't want to jump too far ahead yet. My 2 best buddies in high school were Matt O'Neill and Rich. We did everything together back in the day: hiking, fishing, drinking, beer, four-wheeling, and chasing women. Well, I'll be honest, we only had 4 age-appropriate girls in our little town, so there wasn't a lot of chasing going around. More like trading. But that's another story and not an appropriate one for this book. There were only 9 kids in our high school, total. Rich and Matt had been my homies since we were little boys. In a town with 75 people, you don't have a wide group of people to choose from to be friends with. But even if our town had 10,000 people, the 3 of us would have found each other and been best buds. We were more like brothers than friends. On night 2, we went to Rich's house for dinner. And that is the origin of where this story and book starts and finishes, and where I made a choice that has haunted me for my entire life. Chapter 3. The evening started off fun. Katrina hit it off with Rich and his girlfriend Stephanie, who had moved to town to work as a cook for a mining company, the town's biggest employer. Drinks were consumed, food was eaten, and stories were told. It was fun catching up and reliving some old memories. Then Rich dropped the news. Long story short, Rich's Uncle Raz was a town legend. An old, crusty dude who made his living as a trapper. Raz looked exactly like you'd expect an 80-year-old man nicknamed Raz to look. A wiry, white-bearded, 6'3" and maybe 150-pound old man who still looked like he could kick the crap out of somebody 50 years younger than him. Raz trapped a variety of animals. Wolf, beaver, mink, otter, and marten were his main targets. He lived in an old miner's cabin located on Blank Mountain, which was approximately 70 miles away from Hyder. His real name was Joe Perro, but everybody called him Raz. Why? Who knows? I guess it sounded cooler. His trap line ran several miles up and down the coast and off the base of a couple of the different mountains. Inland, who knows how many square miles he could cover. Nobody else was crazy enough to wander out as far as his mountain area, so Raz had access to 100 square miles of potential trapping areas. To get to his cabin, you would have to boat 70 miles to the shore of the mountain, then hike for about 10 miles through rugged territory to get to the main homestead and cabin area. It wasn't quite that simple, though, as Raz had left several small cabins that he'd built around the area. Why, you ask? Imagine being 10 miles away from your cabin when you run out of daylight, sprain your ankle, have too many animals to haul, etc., and it's freezing cold out. So Raz had built several rudimentary shelters that he could pop into that were stocked with firewood, small amount of food, and where he could spend a comfortable night. Why is this an issue? It's only an issue if you needed to find the old crazy Raz. You could spend days searching for him without success, because there were 10 to 12 different locations he could be chilling and doing his thing. Heck, he could be on a totally different mountain. Raz had a pretty routine schedule. He would make 2 trips to town every year to sell his furs and pelts, to store up on groceries and supplies, and to restock his fuel and gas reserves. There wasn't a specific set date, like October 15th or February 12th, but instead a month range. His family knew he would be home sometime in February and sometime in October. He would spend a few days visiting friends and family, and then drive to the bigger cities to sell his furs and load up on supplies. As a kid, we all loved it when Raz showed up. His white beard would be halfway down his chest, and he would always have a couple of nasty war wounds to show off, and would tell us stories of him having to battle bears, wolves, trolls, leprechauns, and sometimes even an alien story or two. To a young boy, he was better and way cooler than Santa Claus. Today was December 18th, and Raz hadn't returned to drop off his summer haul and restock for the winter season. Cell phones didn't exist back then. Raz could be reached via shortwave radio. Well, he would reach people via the radio when he chose to call, usually after having a few shots of whiskey and he was lonely and wanted to chat with family. Rich, his girlfriend, and our mutual buddy Matt were going to check on his uncle. They were leaving the next day and invited Katrina and I to come along. While it wasn't unusual to not hear from Raz for months at a time, it was extremely unusual for him to not show up for his spring or fall visit. This is where he sold his bounty and collected his money, which allowed him to buy groceries, supplies, new traps, and etc. He wouldn't miss it unless he couldn't make it. Rich and company were the rescue team. While I loved Raz, this was not a trip I initially wanted to make. Boat rides are generally a fun time, but not with large seas. That's waves to you city folk, caused by bone-chilling wind due to freezing cold temperatures. That's not a 5-hour boat ride I was excited to experience. Follow that up with a 4 to 5 hour hike through ice and snow on rough terrain? Not my idea of a fun trip. And what if Raz wasn't holed up at his base camp? That means we sleep in a cabin, warm up by the wood stove, and then spend the following day trampling through even more snow, ice, and rough terrain in hopes of coming across one of his shelters, and repeating that process for several days until we covered all the ground he might be on. That's considering he didn't get lost while exploring new trapping locations. If that was the case, then finding him would be essentially akin to finding a needle in a haystack. Odds are he expanded his trapping area and simply lost track of time. Or the same scenario, but he'd gotten lost. Or Raz was holed up at one of his shelters with a broken foot or leg and had been unable to get back to base camp, and he was waiting for rescue. The worst scenario, which was an actual possibility, was the old man had suffered a heart attack or stroke and passed away. With no access to a hospital, any major life-threatening event almost certainly meant death. I don't know about you, but my idea of a fun winter vacation rarely included finding an old miner frozen to death in the middle of the woods after suffering a heart attack. Not to gross you guys out, but a dead body in the middle of the woods, even a beloved family member, often turns into a meal to several different wild animals. Now that vision is in your head, finding a friend in the woods who died via heart attack and froze to death with his body half-eaten by animals was not something that I'd list as a top 100 things I wanted to experience in my lifetime. But Rich and Matt really wanted us to come with them. It will be an adventure, they said. Having more people search would increase the amount of area that could be quickly explored, and Katrina coming would also give Stephanie a chance to hang with another girl instead of being stuck with just dudes. I explained the severity of the situation to Katrina, all the things I mentioned above, plus no shower for a week, freezing cold temps, eating food cooked over a stove or campfire. It was going to be cold, wet, and miserable. "You'll probably lose a toe or two to hypothermia," I jokingly told her. But alas, my beautiful girlfriend was absolutely fired up to go. To her, it sounded like an amazing adventure, an experience you'd remember for life, something her friends and family back home wouldn't believe, an experience of a lifetime for a city girl. So we decided to go on the rescue mission. 3 old high school friends and 2 girlfriends battling the 30-degree weather, crossing a sea and ocean, hiking around a mountain in the ice and several feet of snow, to search a 25-square-mile area in hopes of finding an 80-year-old miner. How'd you spend your Christmas break? Chapter 4. Rich had a sweet boat, so the water part of our adventure wasn't bad at all. He had a 20-foot sea craft with a fully covered cabin, so we stayed totally warm for the entire 5-hour boat ride. We also lucked out with the weather. There was only a little bit of wind. We had some large swells and white-capped waves, but nothing too bad. I never felt unsafe, and nobody got sick. Opening day success. Our first clue came when we landed at the dock area on the shore of the mountain. Over the years, Raz had built a pretty nice dock and shelter. Like I said, the dude had built shelters all over the island. His 2 boats were at the dock. He had a large boat that he used for longer trips and a skiff that he used to check and set up his traps along the shorelines. This is where he mainly caught mink, and believe it or not, beach traps to catch a wolf. Both boats were firmly secure at the dock. This was good news, as it narrowed our search area down by a good 90%. Since both boats were there, we knew he had to be at his cabin, or somewhere along his normal trapping line. If one boat was gone, then he could have been anywhere. There were 8 different directions he could have boated to, and all had miles of shoreline. And that could have also included a boating accident where he'd been stranded at sea, or maybe even hit a rock or log and sank his boat, which would have made it virtually impossible for us to have ever found him. With both boats safely secured at the dock, we knew the general area where Raz had to be. It was a pretty great start to the trip. At this point, I fully expected to hike to the main base camp and find Raz eating a pot of chili in his warm cabin, sipping a glass of whiskey, with maybe a broken foot or something simple. "I've been waiting for you. What took you so long?" Chapter 5. I don't own stock in a snowshoe company. I'm not a paid spokesman for any snowshoe company. But let me tell you something. Snowshoes are an absolute necessity and a total game changer if you have to traverse through areas covered by snow. With our snowshoes on, we made it from the dock to Raz's cabin in about 4 hours. At some points on the hike, there was a good 2 feet of snow. The snowshoes allow you to stay on top of the snow while you walk. You sink down an inch or 2 or 3, depending on how hard or soft the snow is. But without snowshoes, you'd literally be up to your knees in snow on every step. It's the difference between a 4-hour trip with warm feet compared to a 10-hour trip with freezing cold feet and legs. An absolute lifesaver. It was dark when we finished our walk and arrived at the cabin. We saw nothing useful on the hike to the cabin. Nothing seemed amiss or out of place. It was very cold, but the trail was clearly marked, and the 3 guys in the group had all been to the cabin before. During our youth, we all had made a couple trips to the cabin to visit, explore, and give Raz a hand with various projects. Believe me when I tell you, the hike was a lot more enjoyable in the summer. The presence of a few large animal tracks was a bit alarming for the girls, but we had brought an arsenal of weapons, 2 rifles, 2 pistols, and a large hunting knife. Unfortunately, Raz was not at his cabin. Everything appeared normal, but there wasn't anything unusual about that. Raz would often leave his main cabin for a week or two at a time while he was out running his trap lines. The outside immediate area of the cabin was littered with the faint outline of footprints, mostly boot prints, and a few prints that looked like Raz was walking around barefoot for some reason. Squirrel prints, dog prints. Oh, Raz had a beautiful black lab named Smokey. And even a few black bear prints. It appeared that it hadn't snowed in maybe a week, or at the very least, there was just a very light snowfall. The cabin was a basic cabin setup, one big room, 24 foot by 24 foot, with a small walled-off section that contained a toilet that was attached to a small homemade septic tank. Why no individual rooms, you might ask? The cabin was heated by a wood stove, which radiated heat, so having a wall would shut that room and area off from the heat of the stove. The open area had 4 cots, aka sleeping areas. Raz had a pretty nice double-sized cot on the far east wall near the bathroom. The other 3 cots were on the west wall. 2 were at ground level, maybe a foot off the floor, and were head-to-head or feet-to-feet, however you decided to lay. The 4th cot was bunk bed style, attached to the west wall above the 2 lower ones, and was maybe 5 feet off the floor. We started a huge fire in the wood stove and made some turkey sandwiches from the supplies we'd brought. Tired and wore out, we all crashed within an hour after our arrival. The long boat ride and the 5-hour hike had wiped everybody out. I knew the following day was going to be very challenging. Chapter 6. Eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee were consumed the next morning as we formulated the search party plan. Raz had an old all-terrain cycle, which you youngsters today would call a 3-wheeler or ATV. It was still at the cabin, but was unfortunately broken down. A running 3-wheeler would have increased our search area by 1,000%. Without it, we were forced to walk. But that indicated that Raz also would have been on foot. We found a map that had a rudimentary outline of Raz's shelters and trap lines. That offset the bad news of the broken-down ATC, as we at least had a basic idea of where to specifically look. I don't have a copy of the map to show you a picture, but it was a pretty simple setup. There were 4 main trails leading away from the cabin, and each one had at least one cabin or shelter on it. Some had a couple of shelters, with each one spaced a few miles apart. Raz had built a lot of them, mainly for shelter and safety, but probably also to help cure boredom and to pass the time. A light snow fell our first night, maybe an inch of pretty soft snow, which was another bit of bad news. It wasn't enough to hide the beginning of the trails, but it was enough to mask which trail had been used the most or most recently. Without the snowfall covering the ground, we probably could have figured out which footprints were the freshest, or at least which ones were the oldest, but the new snow ruined that possibility. We decided to split up to cover more ground quickly. Katrina and I took the first trail, while Rich and Stephanie took the second trail. Matt stayed at the cabin. His job was to try and fix the ATC, and to search the area directly around the cabin. Literally, just walk a circle around the cabin, then move out 20 more feet and do another circle. We agreed to spend 4 hours walking out, in our case northwest, and then turn around and come back. Because it was the middle of winter, we had limited daylight. We started on the 2 shortest trails. That would be 8 hours of search time, leaving at 9 a.m. and get back at 5 p.m. just as it was getting dark. If we didn't find Raz the following day, we'd hit the remaining 2 trails, which were both about twice as long as our first 2. On that jaunt of the search, we knew that we might have to stay the night at one of the small shelters. We knew they'd be covered and no doubt have split firewood ready to go. But sleeping in a small A-frame style shelter made Raz's normal cabin seem like the Taj Mahal. Hopefully, we'd find Raz on the first trip. If not, ideally, Matt would have the three-wheeler fixed and ready to go. If so, we could use it to quickly cover both trails on the same day. Chapter 7. If you've hiked in the woods during winter time, you can picture and imagine how our day went. If not, it's hard to explain how dynamic and extreme everything is. I'll give it a shot, though just know I'm not doing it full justice. The scenery is stunning. Like a Norman Rockwell painting, the ground is covered with pure white snow. The trees are a vibrant green, partially covered with snow. The air is amazing. It was hard to breathe because of the cold, 30 degrees, but the air was extremely fresh, crisp, and almost intoxicating. Remember, there were no cars or factories out there. Just the great wide open, trees, flowers, the oceans, rivers, Raz, and whatever animals were running out and about. The clearest air you could ever breathe. There was a deep silence which was constantly broken up by the crunch of our walking, as well as some occasional bird noise, chirping, cawing, singing, etc. If we'd been on the hike while on vacation, it would be described as an extremely magical day. Knowing we might find a friend deceased, maybe frozen to death or half-eaten by animals, certainly put a damper on things. But to be totally honest, we were all pretty young and didn't fully realize the gravity of the situation. Deep down, we all thought that we'd probably find Raz and he just accidentally missed his normal return time. Or he'd had an awesome winter or a terrible winter and had wanted to get in a couple more weeks of trapping. Or at worst, he just had a heart attack and quickly passed away. And we would just find his frozen body in his cabin or shelter. He'd be frozen, but fully clothed, and no animals would have had him for dinner. Katrina and I were still fairly new in our romance, so we spent the hike talking and sharing stories about our lives. Obviously, as a couple that had been dating, we knew all the basic facts about each other. But it was always eating a quick lunch together, driving in a car, dinner, maybe a movie. Most of our time together was spent doing things. Even eating delivery pizza and snuggling on my couch was shared with a time frame of responsibility. Was she staying the night or driving back to the campus? I had an off-campus apartment while she lived in the college dorms. We both had part-time jobs and we both had studying and homework to do, so our lazy evening had a sense of urgency as we had other looming responsibilities. We weren't 40-year-old millionaires who could just lay in bed all day. And if that's you, congrats, bro. I still remember putting boxes of Captain Crunch under my jacket and stealing them from the on-campus cafeteria so I'd have breakfast the next 2 mornings. But out here in the middle of the wilderness, hiking through the snow, it was much easier to just simply talk, to share stories about our youth, funny events, scary things, our high school triumphs, first loves, and how our relationship was with our parents, etc. If you're reading this story and are under the age of 30, you probably have no concept of what I'm describing. Try and imagine not having access to your cell phone or laptop for an entire day. No Facebook, no Instagram, no texting. And having to actually talk with another human being with no distractions. Believe it or not, that's how life was back in the day. And it was amazing. So the time spent walking was pretty magical for both of us. We talked, got to know each other on a deeper level, admired the beautiful scenery, and kept our eyes open for a cranky old man. It took exactly 4 hours to reach our trail's tiny A-frame shelter. It was much nicer than I expected. Super small, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet inside, with the smallest wood stove I'd ever seen. The advantage of that was how easy it would be to haul through the woods. There were several blankets, a pillow, a small first aid kit, a couple of paperback books, a metal box that contained matches and a lighter, a sharp knife, 2 gallons of water, some pills that appeared to be aspirin, several cans of food, and an old bag of beef jerky, The wood stove had a small pot on it. In a pinch, someone could easily spend a night in the shelter if needed. There was no sign of Raz. There was enough snow on the ground to cover any recent footprints, but not enough to cover up if there had been a pathway veering off the main trail that was frequently used. My best guess was that if Raz had been on this route and had gotten hurt or lost, then he had traveled further than the location of the shelter. We rested and ate the sandwiches we'd brought with us. We attempted to have some form of couples interaction. After all, we were still young and in budding love. But it was too cold to fully remove any clothing, and we didn't want to build a fire in the stove. Stomach now full, we then began the hike back to the main campground. Chapter 8. About an hour into the return trip, Katrina stopped and surveyed our surroundings. She nervously said that she had an eerie feeling that something was watching us. I told her not to worry, that there were a lot of animals out there that might be observing us. Birds, owls, squirrels, marten, ermine, deer, maybe a fox, could even be a black bear. But I assured her that none of those animals posed us any danger, and they were more than likely just curious as to the two strange creatures invading their territory, and reminded her that we had bear spray and a gun. I told her that we were probably safer right there than if she was walking around her campus at night or driving on the freeway. After a quick kiss, we resumed the hike. I didn't tell her that I'd had the same spooky feeling since we'd left the small shelter. I'd grown up in the woods, so I was used to the "I feel like something is watching me" feeling. The overwhelming majority of the time it was either nothing or was one of the smaller creatures I'd told Katrina about. And if it was something more dangerous, it was probably just keeping an eye on us while also wanting to avoid us. So no big deal. Just keep walking, talking, and everyone and everything just keep doing their own thing. Even the animals that could be dangerous and do damage, like a grizzly bear or a bobcat, would typically avoid a confrontation with you, unless under some very specific conditions. If you spooked or surprised a bear, or walked up on one while it was eating a fresh kill, or you got between a mom and her babies. Otherwise, you could walk by a bear that was 50 feet away from you in the trees and not even know it was there. Again, I didn't tell Katrina that not only did I feel like we were being watched, but I had a gut feeling it was something big. Probably a bigger black bear or a grizzly. At one point, I'd heard a fairly loud movement in the woods coming from 20 to 25 yards away from us. Katrina had been telling me about some of the evil things her older sister had done to her when they were kids, so she didn't notice the noise. But I did. And it was something that was larger than a rabbit or deer. I clicked the safety off on my gun and made sure that I had easy access to pulling out my can of bear spray, and laughed at Katrina's story while slightly increasing our walking speed. Chapter 9. We arrived back at the main cabin with no issues, just in time as a light snow had started to fall. Matt was there, tending to the fire and cooking hot dogs and chili for us weary explorers. Rich and Stephanie had not returned. Unfortunately, Matt had not been able to get the three-wheeler running, nor had he found Raz or any significant clues as to where he might be. The three of us visited, chatted about life, formulated plans for the following couple of days, took guesses where Raz might be and what might have happened to him. We ate what turned out to be a pretty good dinner. Hiking for 8 hours straight makes you so hungry that even hot dogs and chili taste like a gourmet meal. We didn't worry about Rich and Stephanie until dusk hit and it started getting dark. We all tried to stay calm, but it was nerve-wracking for them not to be back at the cabin. Nerve-wracking for a variety of reasons. They could just be late and were spending the night in one of Raz's side cabins and were perfectly safe. or one of them could be severely injured. They could have been attacked by a bear and were almost mauled to death. They could be completely lost and stuck in the woods while it was snowing and 30-ish degrees. The two would be fighting and struggling to stay alive. Or they could be snuggled up, eating jerky and beans in a warm, cozy cabin. We really should have taken radios with us. But there was nothing we could do. To forge off into the woods at night in the freezing cold would be extremely unsafe. We would have to hope for the best and wait for the morning. Not ideal, but we had no other real option. Chapter 10. This is when the rescue mission took a turn, and not for the better. A loud noise woke me up. It sounded like something walking outside of the cabin. Still drowsy and worn out from all the hiking, I stayed in bed and just listened. I figured it was an animal. Maybe Raz's dog. Maybe a bear. A fox. But whatever animal it might be, we were safe inside the cabin. The only animal that could potentially break in would be a grizzly, but it would make a heck of a commotion and would give us plenty of time to load our guns. The cabin had 2 average-size windows on the left side wall and one on the main wall a couple feet away from the door. So wherever the break-in attempt occurred, one of us could slightly open a window and we would have a clear shot at the bear. Raz knew what he was doing when he built the cabin. My next thought was that maybe the noise was Rich and Stephanie coming back. Maybe they'd been hiking through the night and finally found their way home. After about a minute, I started to get nervous. Whatever was outside was clearly walking around the cabin. It had made a couple of full circles without coming in. That eliminated it being our friends. Seemed like an eternity, but it was probably just a minute or two. I didn't want to wake Katrina, so I gently got out of our bunk and woke Matt up. I sat on the side of his bunk, shook his shoulder, and whispered to him to be quiet and to listen, as I could hear something walking outside. We both jumped a solid foot in the air at the sound of a huge smash against the front door. Bam! 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 3 huge thuds against the cabin door. Not a knocking, but like somebody was hitting the door as hard as they physically could. The smashing noise instantly woke the girls. They screamed and jumped out of bed. Matt and I also jumped up, scared out of our minds. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest. After a couple of seconds, and after the knocking had stopped, we all were able to slightly gather our composure. Matt turned a lantern on, which filled the room with light. I grabbed a rifle and cocked the handle, getting it ready to shoot if need be. "What the heck is going on? What was that?" Katrina asked. I answered that I wasn't sure. Matt said that maybe it was just Rich messing with us. He yelled, "Rich, if that's you, ha ha, you got us. But dude, you know we have loaded guns in here, and you almost got shot. This isn't the time to be screwing around." Katrina asked, "What if it wasn't Rich and Stephanie, but another trapper or hunter, or somebody who'd walked up from the dock?" I said that there was a slim possibility we might run into another person, but not at night. And nobody would be stupid enough to bang on a cabin door in the middle of the night without identifying themselves. So it had to be an animal. Matt agreed. An animal was the only thing that made sense. Matt got a flashlight and looked through the side window, straight out from the cabin and angled towards the front door. He didn't see anything. I'd say it was about 5 minutes after the banging and knocking occurred before we built up the nerve to do what we all knew had to be done. Open the front door and look outside. I told Matt that we were being ridiculous and needed to stop acting like scaredy cats. This wasn't a horror movie. It was probably a raccoon or a black bear that was just testing the door and then ran off. It was silly that 3 grown adults were sitting in a room acting like a monster was lurking outside our front door. He said that he agreed, but his eyes told a different story. Our plan was simple. We had 4 guns. Katrina took a pistol and would open the front door while hiding behind it, using it as a shield in case something was out there. Matt laid down on the floor and pointed his rifle toward the door. Then I, with a pistol and flashlight, would step outside and shine my light and see what I could see. Deep down, I knew we were being silly, just riled up by the situation, searching for Raz, sleeping in a cabin in the middle of the woods, and our friends not returning had put us all on edge. "Open the door, babe. Just a crack. And then when I wave my hand, open it all the way." She told me I was her macho man, and that's why she loved me. Or maybe over the years I made that part up. Who knows? I gave the signal, and Katrina cracked the door open. A blast of ice-cold air immediately engulfed my face. But that was a heck of a lot better than a bear claw. I gave her the go-ahead to open the door all the way. And there it was. Chapter 11. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a fox, not a deer, but a rabbit. A very dead rabbit, lying at the front of the door. I let out a deep sigh, and we all 3 laughed out loud. All the scared minutes and nervousness over a little bunny rabbit. Katrina was the first to speak. How would a little rabbit that size make such a loud banging on the door? She had a point. All we could figure is that the rabbit might have been running full speed, possibly from a predator. Maybe they both crashed into the door. Possibly a fox. And they slammed into the door. They both were stunned for a second, maybe a brief scuffle where they slammed into the door again. The fox heard us inside and took off, and the rabbit ended up dying from going headfirst into the wooden door. Well, that explanation seemed reasonable enough. We chatted for a couple more minutes, and then we all went back to bed. A dead rabbit wasn't going to hurt us. Chapter 12. None of us got a decent night's sleep, but when we woke up, we were all fired up to get back on the search. Now, it was more about finding my friends. Finding Raz would just be a bonus at this point. I was starting to get the feeling we weren't going to find him alive. We'd searched half of his trapline paths. We'd stayed 2 nights at his cabin, all with no sign. It wasn't shaping up to have a positive outcome. But I was pretty sure my friends were still alive, and I wanted to get out and find them. They were probably fine, but just in case they were injured, I got the morning process started and completed as soon as possible. Matt cooked us a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, hash browns, and donuts. Seems excessive, but you have to fuel your body before going out and spending a full day hiking through the snow and freezing weather. Matt was impressive with his cooking. Luckily, the cabin was fully stocked with propane, so we had a normal stove to cook on as well as the wood stove. Our plan was simple. Katrina and I would search the trail that Rich and Stephanie had gone on the day before. Matt would search one of the 2 remaining trails. Same process as before, except we expanded the search time from 4 hours to 5 hours. Go out for 5 hours before turning around and coming back to base camp. Matt found a couple of handheld radios and worked his technical magic and made them somewhat usable. We weren't sure of their range, but it was better than nothing. If the radios didn't work, we had a basic signal to use. 1 gunshot meant we found Rich and Stephanie, and they were fine. 2 shots meant they were injured and/or we needed help. 3 meant they were deceased. So off we went. Chapter 13. Of course it snowed a couple inches during the night, so we didn't have clear tracks to follow. It wasn't that big of a deal as the trail was clearly marked. It would only matter if my friends had gone off trail. I knew Rich was too smart to do that unless something severe had taken place. Katrina and I stayed on the main trail and chugged forward. It was another pretty day, freezing cold, but beautiful out. The birds were chirping, fresh, clean air to breathe, slight moments of snowing off and on. Again, if not for the situation, this would have been a setting that people would pay to experience. Katrina and I talked a lot about the rabbit and what could have caused it to end up dead on our front doorstep, and what the loud banging could have been. She was a real trooper. I was extremely impressed and proud of her. She didn't seem to be scared or freaking out about the situation. You can tell a lot about somebody when they are under duress, and this girl was really impressing me. I remember thinking that she seemed like someone you'd want to marry. She was a total beauty, bearing a striking resemblance to a young Sybil Shepherd. You youngsters might need to look her up. After about 2 hours of hiking, we had our first blast of good news. We heard the faint sound of human voices, so I yelled out a hello. The response was classic Rich. You better have a mug full of hot coffee. A minute later we met up with Rich and Stephanie. The day before, they had lost track of time and hiked a couple miles further than our 4-hour time allotment. They weren't able to make it back to the main cabin before darkness set in, so they camped out at one of the many shelters. If he'd been solo, Rich would have just hiked back to the cabin. But it was freezing out, getting dark, and Stephanie was cold and tired, so they grabbed a small cabin and holed up for the night. No news to report, no sign of Raz. Rich said that he thought he heard a couple significant noises at one point on their hike. He estimated that it was about 30 to 40 yards off trail and was matching their pace. A few times he heard a rustling or a branch breaking. It seemed to leave after about 30 minutes. I told him that we'd had the same experience on our hike. We both agreed that it was probably a bear. Black bear, no problem. Grizzly bear could be a huge issue. We both agreed to be a bit more alert and to have our guns as easily accessible as possible. A grizzly bear attack often came without warning. You might only have the opportunity to get off one shot before the 500-pound bear was on top of you. A close-up shot with a .357 wasn't going to necessarily stop a full-grown grizzly, but it might make the beast stop and think for a second, which would allow you to get off a couple more shots. We both acknowledged that we needed to be on high alert. We all started hiking back to the cabin. The trail ranged from 3 feet to 6 feet of walking area widthwise. Some places were tighter than others, 3 feet, while others it opened up to 6 feet across. The sides also featured a variety of situations. There might be 200 yards where the trail sides were large trees, and you felt like you were trapped in a wooded submarine. Then there might be a mile of just small alders and brush. The scenery and terrain was similar, but the changes made the hiking more interesting for sure. Chapter 14. We hiked about a mile when we heard a horrible noise. An animal in pain, grunting and growling. Something was being attacked. This isn't unusual in the woods, especially as deep in the wilderness as we were. Bigger predators attacked, killed, and ate smaller animals. Circle of life. We knew this, but it's a little disconcerting to actually hear it happening. We've all watched Animal Kingdom videos on TV and seen cheetahs attack a gazelle or a lion attack a zebra. But to be close to it happening and hear the noises from both animals, that's a whole different ball game. The fear factor increased a dozenfold when we heard bushes and small trees start to snap. Whatever was happening was coming our way. Something was thrashing and running through the woods and coming straight towards us. "What do we do? What do we do?" somebody said. It was one of the girls. I don't know which one. The thing was getting closer and closer. The same voice screamed, "I don't want to die." The animal was almost upon us. It was going that fast. In a matter of maybe 5 seconds, it went from "something is moving" to "it's about to hit us." I fumbled to get my gun out. Before I could click the safety off, a ball of brownness burst through my side of the trail and crashed right into the middle of all 4 of us. Something sharp jammed into my shoulder. Rich and I were knocked over while the girls were able to jump out of the way before both slipped and fell on the ice and snow. I felt like I'd been hit by a train, and there was a huge splash of blood everywhere. I laid on the ice and tried to clear my head and assess the situation. It felt like I'd been shot in the shoulder. Rich let out a huge laugh and a couple swear words. Why in the world was he laughing? Stephanie was crying. Katrina just looked stunned. "Dude, that was an elk. We just got run over by an elk." Rich had jumped up and was visibly relieved by his discovery. "We aren't getting mauled today, boys." The girls also got up and wiped themselves off. The elk was lying about 10 yards away from us, with half its body visible on the path and half its body stuck in some brush on the side of the trail. "Whew!" Rich yelled. "Thank you, God!" His adrenaline was flowing, but he was right. We were lucky that it had just been a small elk. But regardless of our lucky break, I was still in extreme pain. One of the elk's horns had almost punctured my skin. Luckily, my coat was thick enough and the elk's horn wasn't sharp enough, so it didn't just cut straight into me like a knife. But it hurt like you know what, and I ended up having surgery on it after returning to civilization. Imagine somebody winding up with a sledgehammer and hitting you full force in the shoulder, then double that amount of pain. That's where I was at. The group gathered around me, and we went over any injuries and how everybody was feeling. Nobody else was hurt. Katrina scraped her knee while jumping away, but in her awesomeness, she just said, just a little lost skin and blood. I'll be as good as new tomorrow." She was in a snowsuit, so she was taking a guess. I let them know that my shoulder was significantly injured and that it hurt to even breathe. I could walk back to the main cabin, but I wasn't standing up for at least the next 5 minutes. Then Stephanie asked the question that snapped us back to reality. "That poor elk is torn to shreds. We all have its blood on us. What caused that?" I'll never forget the look in my friend Rich's eyes. He went from being relieved to a look of despair. "And it was chasing the elk, right? So doesn't that mean it's still pretty close?" Katrina then chimed in with a soul-crushing response. "If something is chasing and planning on eating that elk, and we are standing here covered in blood between it and the elk, how safe are we right now?" At that instant, we heard a loud crash in the brush back by where the elk was laying. We all whipped our heads around to see what the noise was. You know how in modern-day horror movies, a commonly used trope is to see a human lying on the ground looking at you, and then a mysterious creature, out of view of your eyesight, pulls the victim backward through the woods, and all you see is the person lying down in the Superman pose being quickly pulled backwards into the distance. That's almost exactly what happened on the trail. We all turned and looked at the elk and the side of the trail where the noise came from. A second later, something pulled the 300-pound elk into the brush like it was a 5-pound Pomeranian. All we could see in the thick bushes was a brief glimpse of brownish, blackish fur. The speed at which the elk was yeeted off the trail was spectacular. Literally in the snap of a finger, it was gone. "What just happened? What took it?" Stephanie asked. Her voice was shaking like crazy. "Probably a bear. A bobcat isn't strong enough to pull a full-grown elk like that," Rich answered. I was the smart one of the group and said, "We need to get the heck out of here immediately. Let's get moving. Nobody run. Just stay close to each other, and let's quietly walk away, now." I needed help to stand up. My shoulder was throbbing, the pain shooting down to my hand and fingers, but no amount of pain was going to keep me in that spot. Chapter 15. We walked at a steady pace for a solid 30 minutes before stopping to catch our breath. We hadn't heard any noise in the woods, so we assumed the elk killer was a mile away from us, sitting comfortably in the woods and eating its kill. We all took a big drink of water. Those with guns checked to make sure they were loaded and ready to use if needed. Stephanie was holding bear spray with her finger on the trigger, ready to let it fly. Rich asked me if the attacker was a bear. We couldn't figure out anything else it could be. Unfortunately, it probably had to have been a grizzly. Even a big alpha male black bear would have trouble dragging a 300-pound elk like it was a pillow. We had enough firepower to keep us safe from an attacking grizzly. Maybe. If we saw it coming, we would be able to unload several shots into the beast. If it charged from the trees and caught us by surprise, again, we had enough firepower to probably take it down. But one or two of us would probably be mauled a bit. "Well, let's hope that elk fills him up," Katrina said, laughing. "Now, let's get back to the cabin." We all agreed, our nerves finally settling down. Crack! Never has the sound of a branch breaking in the woods carried such a huge, overflowing amount of fear into a group of hikers. One of us said, "No." Another responded that it was probably just a squirrel or deer. The second crack and then rustling sound sent me personally into dreamland. My heart felt like it fell from my chest down to my stomach. The noise in the bush didn't stop. In fact, it was getting louder and coming towards us. Rich screamed, "Run!" And that's exactly what we did. As luck would have it, we were almost at Raz's property. 60 seconds and we were at the cabin. Remember, we had snowshoes on, so our full-speed running was more like a slow jog. That time period was a blur. But I do know that whatever was chasing us eventually left the woods and was running behind us on the trail. I could hear grunting and growling along with heavy footsteps. This all happened in less than a minute. But at some point, I realized the animal noises and heavy footsteps were gathering on us and getting closer and closer. I was just about to tell Rich to stop and turn around and open fire. I awkwardly tried to position my rifle into a spot where I'd just have to turn around, aim, and start shooting. But as we rounded a small corner, I realized we'd run up to the cabin. A couple seconds later, we all smashed through the front door. I don't know if we beat the animal by 2 seconds or 10 seconds, but we all made it inside before it did. That's all that mattered. Chapter 16. The girls were screaming, but Rich and I managed to somewhat keep our composure. We put the girls up against the far wall that was facing the front door. We gave both girls a pistol and told them to start shooting as soon as the animal burst through the door. I positioned myself directly to the right of the door. If the animal knocked the door over or it smashed the lock and the door swung open, as soon as it got 1 foot in the door, I'd have a wide-open shot from about 2 feet away. Rich set up in one of the windows to try and get a look at what was chasing us. And we waited. I tried not to crap my pants. Tried to stay calm, quadruple checked to make sure my rifle's safety was off, and waited for this bear to try and break into the cabin. Each second that ticked off the clock seemed like an hour. Tick, tick, tick. After about a minute, we heard something push against the door. I whispered to the girls to not shoot yet. It could be Matt coming home, or heck, even Raz. We needed to make sure it was an animal and not a person before we mass opened fire. I yelled, "Who's there? Is that you, Matt?" No response. But again, something pushed against the door. I asked Rich what he could see. His answer was chilling. "I don't know, man, but it's huge." And that was it. There was no more action at the front door. Whatever Rich saw quickly darted off in the opposite direction of the window, so he wasn't able to get a good direct look at the animal. His only conclusion was that it was the biggest grizzly bear that he had ever seen. Freaking huge! Took up the entire area in front of the door. Nothing else it could be except the biggest bear in Alaska history. We waited outside for about an hour before gathering up the nerve to open the door and check outside. We probably would have waited longer, but Matt still wasn't back yet, and we didn't want him to stroll up on a raging bear in attack mode. I took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and then slowly opened the front door of the cabin. A burst of cold air flooded us. A few random snowflakes floated in, and nothing else. The bear was gone. Probably long gone, as I'm sure he went back to his elk to finish his guaranteed dinner. We were all scared and freaked out, but as the adrenaline wore off, we all agreed that we had just experienced an event that would be a story we'd share for life, even though most of our friends would never believe it. "Once my parents find out that you almost got me mauled and killed by a grizzly bear, they are never going to let me marry you," Katrina joked. It was a little too soon to even joke about marriage for me, but under the circumstances, I had to let my hot girlfriend share her jokes, and she was probably right. Her parents were not going to be thrilled that I'd brought their daughter into a situation like this. I was starting to question the logic of our search as well. Chapter 17. We knew that Raz was a seasoned hunter, trapper, and outdoorsman who could handle himself in the wilderness. We were not. Bringing two girls into the middle of nowhere where the only escape was via boat and on an island that had predators on it, namely grizzly bears, was not my brightest idea. We talked about what had just happened and tried to make sense of it. The bear was probably pissed that we had interrupted his hunt and thought we were trying to steal its prey. It probably just wanted to scare us off. But when we ran, its hunting instinct kicked in, and the chase was on. We all had a form of a weapon, but I knew that if the bear had reached one of us, we might have eventually killed or injured it. But the bear would have inflicted a ton of damage to a couple of us, or maybe even all four. It would have been brutal. We all openly credited our close location to the cabin as being a lifesaver. And then an hour later, we were safe and sound, sitting around a warm fire and eating dinner. We now just had to wait for Matt to get back. We finished eating at about 5 p.m., just as dusk was setting in. We knew Matt had gone on a different path than the one we had just gotten chased down, so logically, he shouldn't cross paths with the bear and should be safe. Him being late to return was probably a good thing in that regard. Much better to return an hour after the bear had left than while it was still knocking on our door. Matt was an avid outdoorsman, hunter, and trapper. Of the five of us, he could easily handle himself if he had stayed the night at one of the smaller cabins, or even just hiking at night. So at that point, we weren't too worried. We sat around and chatted for a bit, shared some personal stories, talked about our plan for the following day and discussed our options if we didn't find Raz. We debated if the noisemaker from night 1 was the same bear from that day, or if it was a smaller animal. We agreed that it was probably the bear, which meant it was familiar with the cabin area, and that we were going to have to be extremely careful and on our toes the rest of the trip. We owed Raz one more day of looking. He deserved that. Luckily, there was just one more trail and path that needed to be explored, so all 5 of us could go together. I didn't want to run into the bear again. But with 5 of us in a group and 3 with gun experience, I wasn't too worried. Chapter 18. Once the food coma set in and the adrenaline wore off, we all accidentally dozed off. I remember thinking that I'd just close my eyes for half an hour, and then if Matt wasn't back, we'd go out a little ways and see if we could find him. Heavily armed, of course. Just hike a little way up the trail he'd gone on earlier that day and see what we could see. We'd tried our radio several times but hadn't gotten a response. But that could be because of distance, the weather, or maybe even just one of them being faulty. I was startled awake by a huge crash on the cabin door. I wasn't immediately sure if it was just a dream, and if it was real, how loud it actually was. I remember opening my eyes and trying to figure out what was happening. It was darker in the cabin than when we'd fallen asleep, so I knew it had to be late in the evening. The noise was probably Matt coming home. I glanced at my watch, and it was 8:35 p.m., a time I'll never forget. I couldn't believe I had slept 3 hours. All 3 of my roommates were still asleep. Approximately 30 seconds after I initially woke up, another huge crash banged on the side of the cabin. This time it wasn't at the front door, but on the east side of the building. It was heavy enough to make the entire structure rattle a bit. Imagine the noise when a 50, 60-mile-per-hour wind smashes into your house. That's what it sounded like. The second bang woke up the rest of the crew. Stephanie asked if it was Matt. I told her it wasn't. He was smart enough to not mess around outside a cabin where people had guns. She asked if it was the bear coming back. Before I could answer, the south side wall was hit hard enough that it sounded like the wall cracked. Both girls screamed. Rich and I jumped up and quickly set up our defense just like the prior night. This time, we were more prepared. We had several guns loaded and ready to use. Katrina backed into the bathroom, the only extra room in the cabin, with the bear spray and a .22 pistol. I told her if the bear did get into the cabin, to just hide in the bathroom, and hopefully it wouldn't come after her. But if it did slam through the door, or even poke its head in, she should unload the bear spray right in his face. That would be a way more effective defense than a .22 shot. If it didn't run out of the cabin, then she could unload her gun into it. 1 shot wouldn't kill a grizzly, but 6 quick shots into its body or face would definitely do some damage and send the beast on its way. Stephanie was on a top bunk with her rifle. She had a little bit of shooting experience, so we set her up with the rifle. The cabin was small enough where a rifle was going to be tough to use. If it was attacking Rich and me, then she could just shoot pot shots into its body. And make bleepin' sure you don't shoot one of us, Rich lovingly yelled at his girlfriend. But if the bear lunged and attacked her, she would only have time for 1 shot. Rich had a shotgun, which was a pretty effective gun if a bear attacked you in a small area like a cabin. At close range, you really couldn't miss. A shotgun blasted out a handful of pellets, spraying anything close. Grizzly bears have extremely large and strong skulls. Hunters have shot bears in the head and had the bullet fail to penetrate the skull. Instead, the bullet hits the skull and slides around it. A charging bear will just shake its head and keep attacking. Later, hours later, the damage will kick in. The headache of a lifetime, a future scar on its head, but the bear would probably survive. A shotgun was more effective on a close attack. It wouldn't kill the bear, but a blast to the face would deliver 50 hornet stings to the bear's nose, eyes, and mouth. That would more than likely deter the bear, even for just a minute or two, which would give you time to quickly unload more shots into it. The bear must have been making a circle around the cabin, trying to find the best way to get inside. It kept pounding hard into the west wall. With each blow, we all tensed up, let out gasps, and tried to prepare ourselves for the potential attack. Rich yelled for us all to stay calm, focus on what our job was, and that none of us were going to die tonight. I wanted to believe him, but didn't. The bear was relentless. It kept going around the cabin, banging on the front door, smashing into the side walls. Up to that point, this was without a doubt the scariest moment of my young life. Thank the Lord that Raz had made his cabin with such high-quality wood and workmanship. This beast smashed on the door so hard that it sounded like thunder was blasting in the sky. The walls shook, and items inside the cabin, chairs, table, etc., bounced around like we were experiencing a small earthquake. But that solid door didn't break or come off its hinges. It seemed impossible that it could take the extreme pounding, but it did. The bear smashed into the door 6 to 7 times over maybe 5 minutes, and then stopped. The 3 of us stayed tense for a couple of minutes, guns pointed at the door, ready to engage. But the attack was seemingly over. Chapter 19. After maybe 30 minutes, we got up the nerve to look out the door. Rich fired several shots of his rifle into the woods, just a desperate tactic to scare the bear off if it was still around. We closed the door and assured the girls that it wouldn't be back that night. They were able to eventually relax and go to sleep. No doubt not a good night's sleep, but both girls slumbered into a restless sleep. Rich and I stayed up talking and working out our plan for the next day. Our priority now was finding Matt. Then we both agreed that we should get the heck out of Dodge and go home. We hadn't found Raz yet, nor seen any sign of him at all. We needed to get to our boat and get the heck away from the huge beast that was trying to kill us. That much we both agreed on. It had to be a grizzly, and if he was bold enough to try and get in the cabin once, he'd surely be back to try again. Then Rich asked me a question that changed the entire narrative of our trip. A simple question, but the most life-altering question I'd ever been asked, or asked since. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Did you see the footprints? Because of the light snowfall from earlier in the day, there were visible new footprints in front of the cabin, but I hadn't taken a good look at them. I asked Rich why. I didn't want to ask you while the women were still awake. Did you see the footprints in front of the cabin? Maybe you should go look. Opening the cabin door wasn't the most exciting idea, but the serious look on Rich's face told me that he wasn't joking. I needed to check out the footprints. I stood up, walked to the door, and slowly opened it. It took a few seconds to register what I was seeing. At that time, my mind couldn't process the info it was receiving. I shut the door and sat back down at the table. What the heck, dude? That can't be real. I mean, this can't be happening, is it? Rich just nodded his head, yes. What else could it be? I couldn't believe it, but the truth was there, clearly marked in the snow. It wasn't a bear that had been trying to get into our cabin. It wasn't a bobcat. And it wasn't a crazed human. The footprints painted a picture that I couldn't believe. The footprints in front of the cabin looked like they were made from a human walking barefoot with no shoes or socks on, and a human that had to have size 17 or 18-inch feet. Imagine your tall buddy who played basketball and wore the biggest shoes you've ever seen. Then add 6 more inches to the length and 3 more inches of width. That's what was banging on our cabin and trying to break in. A freaking Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, whatever you want to call it. We had been attacked by a Bigfoot. What the heck else could it be? A 10-foot-tall man, covered in hair, out walking in the freezing cold weather with no shoes or socks on, in the middle of nowhere? Rich reminded me of what he'd seen the prior night. He rationalized it being a huge bear that was standing on its back feet. Now it made more sense. It was standing on 2 feet because it was a Bigfoot and not a bear. Chapter 20. We let the girls sleep, but Rich and I stayed awake and talked about what we'd seen and what it meant. Obviously, living in Alaska, we knew all about Bigfoot. All the local native tribes had Bigfoot legends. Back then, Alaska was still the big undiscovered wilderness. All our grandfathers and uncles claimed to have seen the big hairy beast. Of course, once you get older, the shine and realism of those tales doesn't hold the same weight as when you were a child. I had always been on the fence. It was a cool story, and Alaska does have more forest and mountain areas than all other states, so it wasn't too hard to believe that there might be Sasquatches living in the deep woods. But I'd spent thousands of hours in the deep wilderness of numerous Alaska forests, hiking to places that might never have been walked on by man before, or at least not for decades or hundreds of years. We'd taken our skiff to various places, then hiked, explored, hunted, and camped out at some crazy out-of-the-way spots, and ran into all kinds of different animals: bear, deer, wolverine, fox, bobcats, wolves, coyotes, but never a Bigfoot. We'd never seen a single one, never randomly found a track, nothing, ever. Rich was always a big believer, but I was always firmly on the fence. Until that moment. There was no other explanation. We were being stalked by a Bigfoot, and that was more scary than being hunted by a bear. A bear was somewhat predictable. He was big and fierce and extremely dangerous, but not the brightest animal. Sure, it would be hard to do, but a bear could be killed. A Bigfoot? Now that was a different story. From the size of footprints and what Rich had gotten from his brief look through the window earlier the night before, this creature had to be 8 to 9 feet tall and probably weighed at least 600 to 700 pounds, and nobody knew how intelligent these things were. Bottom line, battling a Bigfoot was going to be a heck of a lot harder than fighting a bear. This was truly unbelievable. How in the heck were we being stalked by a Bigfoot? I was still having trouble processing what was actually happening. The fact that this beast had remained alive with Raz around, who was an expert hunter and trapper, made me doubt how the 4 or 5 of us were going to battle this thing. Speaking of that, how did it work? If this creature had tried to attack Raz, he would have shot and killed it. So how did the two exist in the same area? Were they friends? Enemies? At this point, we had to assume that Raz was probably dead. Whether it was by natural causes, an accident, an animal attack, or, for Pete's sake, a Bigfoot attack, he was probably already gone. We both agreed that the obvious right answer was to leave as soon as it was light enough to start hiking down to the beach where the boat was parked. Unfortunately, Matt hadn't returned. We couldn't leave until he returned or we found him. That posed a very large problem. We seemed pretty safe inside the cabin, but we didn't want to leave the girls alone while we went and searched for Matt. But we also didn't want to bring them out into the woods. The Bigfoot had left us alone the first 2 days. Why the sudden turn to aggressive and violent attacks? And what would tomorrow be like? Is this thing going to keep trying to attack us? Or now that it had its fun, would it be moving on? We knew we had to be as cautious as possible and expect more attacks. We had to act like it was an all-out war. Man against beast. Rich and I decided to take shifts for the rest of the night. I'd sleep for 3 hours while he stayed awake and kept watch. He would sleep for 3 hours while I stayed awake and kept watch. Then we'd wake the girls up and solidify the day's plan. It took about an hour as my mind was racing, but I finally managed to fall asleep. My shoulder injury wasn't helping. A handful of aspirin dulled the pain, but certainly didn't take it away. Katrina made me a homemade sling which seemed to help stabilize things a bit. I woke up to Rich shaking my shoulder and whispering, "It's back." I jumped up and grabbed a pistol. My head was spinning. From the lack of sleep or from the overwhelming, crushing realization of being attacked by a freaking Bigfoot, I was barely holding on mentally. Rich had his pistol in his hand and whispered to me that he'd not heard anything for about an hour. Then he heard a loud noise against the cabin door, like a small animal bumped against it, and that's it. That was a relief. Its back could have meant that the creature was back and was trying to break into the cabin. No noise except a small bump on the door? That could be anything. Heck, Rich was so fried it could have even been a gust of wind, and he'd overreacted. It might even be just another rabbit. "Maybe it's Matt. We gotta look," I told him. Neither of us wanted to open the door, especially since it was still pitch dark outside. But in case it was Matt, we had to look. Our friend could be lying on the porch too weak or hurt to open the door. We had to look. The girls were still sleeping. Unlike last time, we just pulled the Band-Aid off with the door opening. We both had our weapons. Rich quickly yanked the door open. Words can't explain what we found. We found Matt. Unfortunately, just part of him. Our lifelong friend's head was lying on the porch, right in front of the door. No body, just a head. No blood, just a head. Chapter 21. It was too crazy and radical to even comprehend what was happening. We were sitting in a cabin, deep in the woods, hundreds of miles away from our hometown, being stalked by a Sasquatch, who just left our good friend's head on our doorstep as a warning. This cannot be happening. But it was. Out of panic, Rich picked up Matt's head by his hair and brought it inside the cabin. I slammed the door shut and bolted the lock. The slamming of the door woke both girls. Stephanie sat up and asked what was going on. Rich, who was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, said, "Not much," and pointed to the head, which he had just sat down on the kitchen table. The next couple of minutes played out exactly like you'd imagine. Screaming, people freaking out and getting hysterical. More screaming. Once the shock started to wear off, we all realized that Rich had made the right call. We couldn't just leave Matt's head sitting outside where it could have been dragged off by an animal. We needed to take it home to show authorities. Slapping it on the table might not have been the most prudent route. But hey, Who has the experience to draw on as to what actions to take when finding your childhood buddy's head sitting on your doorstep? Put there by a Bigfoot. If this has happened to you, then I hope you've also written a book about it. After putting the head in a bag, we debated what our next step should be. We all agreed that we needed to get the heck out of there as soon as possible. It was still dark, so there was no way we were stepping foot outside the cabin at that point. As soon as it was light enough, we would pack up the head, make sure all our weapons were ready for use, and then bust out to the boat. If we were lucky, the Bigfoot would have gone in any of the other directions that weren't the trail to the dock and the boat. To help keep the girls calm, I told them that odds were that he was a mile or two into the woods back at his normal home, so we'd have a smooth trip back to the boat. If this was an intelligent being who was pissed off we were invading his territory, then he might be happy we were leaving and wouldn't bother us on our way out. Katrina asked if the Bigfoot had killed Raz. Very valid question. One we didn't have an exact answer for. At the moment, the obvious answer would be probably. But that would bring up a bunch more questions. The first being, why? Raz had been living in this specific area for more than 20 years. If the Bigfoot had killed him, why? Had the two lived in the area harmoniously for years, decades, leaving each other alone? If so, then why did the Bigfoot decide to kill him? Did they have a fight? Did one go too far into the other one's territory? Or maybe the Bigfoot was a migratory creature and had just recently moved into this specific area. Raz had never mentioned that he was sharing his area with a Bigfoot, but that didn't mean he'd never seen one before. It could also mean that he had seen one and he'd lived in the same area as one totally peacefully. He didn't tell anybody because, 1, people might not believe him and would ridicule him and say he was crazy. 2, he didn't want some frisky hunter to make a trip to the area to try and become famous by shooting a Bigfoot. Or, again, maybe the huge creature had just traveled into the area. Who knows? So many questions and potentially different explanations. But right then, that night, there was no way to know which one was true. For the 2 hours we had to kill before we had enough daylight to leave the cabin, these are the questions we asked and pondered. Chapter 22. The 2 hours took an eternity. Every sound we heard was the hairy beast returning. The wind, a piece of snow falling off the roof, a random cabin creak. All our senses were heightened, and the paranoia was out of this world. I felt like I drank 20 cups of coffee. Finally, my watch read 5:30. The darkness outside had started to lighten. We were dressed, snowshoes on, guns locked and loaded, Matt's head in a bag. We were ready to go. Stephanie led us in a group prayer. God, please have that Bigfoot a couple miles away in the opposite direction that we are going. And please, let him leave us alone, were a couple sentences I'd never thought I'd hear in a prayer. Rich slowly opened the door and peeked out. It had snowed a couple of inches, which wouldn't affect our hike that much physically, but the constant heavy falling snow would impede our vision. We had clear sight for maybe 20 to 30 yards, but the further the distance, the heavy snow started limiting what we could see. At about 50 yards, our vision was limited by probably 50%. At 100 yards, it was 70%. There was nothing on the porch. No Bigfoot, no bear. Nothing but freshly fallen snow. Let's go. Everybody stay close. And if anybody hears anything at all, alert the group, Rich said. We all agreed and moved onto the porch. We waited about 30 seconds to see if anything would happen. Nothing did. We walked off the porch and onto the front area of the cabin. We waited about 10 seconds. Nothing charged. No noises. Let's do this, guys. Let's try and keep a steady pace and be as quiet as possible. Rich added that in 5 hours we'd be on a boat and would be safe and sound. I agreed with him, but knew that boating in this heavy of snow would be extremely dangerous, especially if the wind, it was maybe 5 to 10 miles per hour, picked up. Boating without visibility isn't the safest option. But my main focus was to just get to the boat. We walked for about a minute before Katrina uttered one solitary 4-letter word. It starts with an F and ends with a K, and it isn't fork. I asked if she was okay, hoping she hadn't twisted her ankle or something. She had stopped walking while the rest of us took a couple steps before stopping. She lifted her arm and pointed straight ahead of us down the trail. We all looked. With the snow falling, it took a couple seconds for my eyes to adjust and focus on what Katrina was pointing out. The trail was flanked on both sides by large trees forming what essentially looked like a tunnel. With the snow falling and not being able to see above us more than maybe 15 to 20 feet, it really looked like an actual tunnel. Pretty magical looking, if not for the circumstance. "You've got to be kidding me," somebody said. Heck, it could have been me that said it. The sight of what was about 70 to 75 yards away from us was more powerful than any mental or physical transaction that was taking place. The Bigfoot had returned. Even at 70 yards away, it was extremely massive. With the snow falling and distorting the view, it made everything 100 times more creepy. It was light out, but not very bright yet. But unfortunately, that wasn't all. Standing beside the big one were 2 more creatures. Beast number 2 was almost as large as the big guy, maybe a foot shorter. The width of the body was maybe 20% smaller. The third one was about a foot shorter than number 2. When I look back on it, I'd guess the size and weight would be 9 feet, 600 pounds, 8 feet, 500 pounds, and the smallest one was 7 feet, 400 pounds. Per the weight estimate, they weren't fat at all. Those pounds were thick, solid masses of muscle. From this distance, and with the snowflakes, I couldn't get a real detailed look at their faces. They were big, hulking, reddish-brown, hairy beasts. Imagine a gorilla and an orangutan combined, but standing straight up like a human, with extremely long arms and massive bodies. This appeared to be a family. Mom, Dad, and child. One of the girls asked, "What do we do?" With there now being 3 creatures, our options were pretty limited. If it was just one beast, and with the 4 of us all being armed, I liked our chances. But there was no way the 4 of us, with 2 people who weren't experienced gun users, and me with a bum shoulder, would have any chance at all battling 3 huge beings. Neither group moved. The Bigfoot stood their ground, staring us down. We were all too scared to make a move and weren't exactly sure what our best option was. Rich said that he could hit one of them with his rifle from this distance. A headshot would be instant death. A chest shot would more than likely be instant death. A leg or hip shot would probably incapacitate the animal, even if it didn't kill him. But anywhere else, we'd be in trouble. If Rich took out the big one and I shot at the middle one, we might have a chance. If he took out the big one with one shot and we both unloaded on the other 2, if they charged, we would no doubt be able to put a couple bullets into it before she got to us. And heck, if we took the father out, the other 2 might just run away. The problem was the weather. If it was summer out, 70 degrees. We just lay down on the ground, relax, take our time, and place the sight in on the mom and dad, and fire. But it was 35 degrees, windy and snowing. Both of us would be shaking when we took our shots. Even a military sniper would be hard-pressed to make a dead-on shot under these conditions. So our only option was to get back to the cabin. We were 100 yards away. Could we make it before the Bigfoot? There was no real way to tell, as we hadn't seen them run. We were in snowshoes and on snow, so our running speed would be pretty slow. More of a jog. I was fairly certain that the Bigfoot could run faster than us, but they didn't have snowshoes, and they were easily 2 or 3 times our weight, so they'd probably be sinking into the snowpack. Running back to the cabin was clearly our best option. The girls and I were going to slowly turn around and start walking back towards the cabin. Rich was going to try and walk sideways besides us so he could watch what the Bigfoot were doing. We thought that if we walked at a slower to normal pace, maybe they'd ignore us or just go back to their own area. Stephanie said, "Maybe they are thinking the same thing about us that we are thinking about them. Maybe they are scared and curious, and they don't know what to do." I lifted the bag that had Matt's head in it. "I don't think so." We slowly turned around and started to walk back the way we'd came. We made it about 10 seconds before Rich grunted, "They are coming." I asked how fast. Rich yelled, "Run as fast as you can." We did. As fast as we could, which was, like I mentioned before, pretty much just a normal speed jog. After a couple seconds, gunshots rang through the air. Pop, pop, pop. I glanced over my shoulder and was gutted by what I saw. Rich was either a hero or an idiot, or a combination of both. His ego probably told him that he could take down all 3 animals before they reached us. I'd like to think that his heart also compelled him to give up his own life to save the 3 of us. He'd laid down on the snow in the shooter's position and was firing shots at the 3 animals who were now charging. I couldn't see if he was hitting them. All I could really tell was that they were extremely fast. They were moving 4 to 5 times faster than we were. I yelled at the girls, "Go faster." I had to make an instant decision. Stop running and join my buddy Rich and start shooting and hope I could hit and kill or slow them down, or keep running with the girls back to the cabin. My overwhelming thought was that if Rich and I both were killed, then the girls would have no chance at survival. Not just because they wouldn't have the 2 of us to help protect them, but also because they wouldn't have the rifles to use either. They had a couple of pistols, which were good for close-range use, but not so good for shooting things at a distance. Heck, the rifles were more valuable than our manly strength. I turned slightly and looked over my shoulder. If Rich had dropped one of the beasts, or heck, if somehow he'd miraculously injured 2 of them, then we might have a chance. As I was turning, I heard one more pop. What I saw was so surreal that my brain could barely make sense of what was happening. I saw the smaller creature dive through the air and land on top of Rich. By the time they rolled a couple times, from the momentum the other 2 caught up and jumped into the melee. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in like a ton of bricks. It told me, "Run! Run as fast as you can." The last thing I saw before turning around was the mother grabbing one of Rich's legs and literally ripping it off the rest of his body. She stood straight up, holding Rich's leg from the knee down, and stared at me, while the other 2 continued to savagely rip his body apart. It was like a scene from a horror movie. I turned and focused on moving as fast as possible. We made it to the cabin. Rich had definitely saved our lives. If he hadn't stopped and distracted the Bigfoot, they would have easily caught up with us. And instead of one of us being dead and ripped to shreds, all 4 of us would be torn apart. Before running into the cabin, while standing on the porch, I turned and took one last look. The big one was standing about 25 yards away. We locked eyes. "Leave us alone," I yelled. "We've done nothing to you." The beast responded. It's hard to describe the sound he made. Not a roar like a lion, not a grunt like an ape. More of a large, deep, bellowing grunt, so deep and thunderous that I just didn't hear it, but could feel the vibrations deep down in my bones. He let out 2 of them, each one lasting 4 to 5 seconds. This thing was pissed off. As I started to turn and go for the door, the Bigfoot pulled back his hand and launched the item he was holding towards me. I assumed it was a large rock. I took a quick step towards the door and unfortunately slipped a little bit on the snow and ice and fell to one knee. With precise aim, the thrown object slammed into my back and knocked me forward totally off my feet. I crashed into the side of the cabin. In a weird moment of insanity, my initial thought was, "Man, that's going to leave a mark." And I chuckled. Katrina ran outside onto the porch and tried to snap me back to reality. She yelled at me to get up and get in the cabin. As I jumped up, my hand pushed off the rock that had knocked me down. It wasn't a rock. It was Rich's head. Still somewhat delirious, I turned and yelled, "Stop ripping my friends' heads off, you SOB!" Katrina pulled me inside and slammed the cabin door shut. I put Rich's head in the same duffel bag that Matt's head was in. Stephanie was lying on one of the beds sobbing. Katrina asked me, "What were we going to do?" I had no answer. All right, my Sasquatch. Well, I know this has been a long one, and we are not through with this encounter, so I hate to leave you there. We still have chapters 20. We've got about 7, 8 more chapters, and these next couple chapters are a little longer. I think there's about 10 or 12 more pages, I think. So I'm going to stop here for now. My voice is about to give out. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I know I picked an awful spot to leave you, but maybe it's the best kind, because I know you're going to be right back here on Tuesday to hear the rest. At least I hope so. Again, if you're interested in this book was written by Brad Grogan. It's called The Big Book of Bigfoot. And there are true encounters in there. This is also a true encounter, what I've been reading tonight. At least the man who gave it to Brad swears that it was. But there are more encounters. And there are some really interesting interviews with a lot of people within the Bigfoot community that I know there are names you will recognize. So I will have a link to that in my video description below if you're interested in this book. Otherwise, tune in for part 2, and that will be Tuesday. But until then, please always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.